quite emotional. It's all right.
Are you angry with us? Yes.
Welcome back to Most Haunted Live, and what you've just been watching was, of course, an experiment under strict scientific and health and safety guidelines. There was no question of Carl Beattie being there in any physical danger. However, it was designed to try and not only intensify the emotions around an execution to provide almost a near-death experience, but also to see if those emotions might generate other manifestations. It's known as the Singapore experiment. It should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway: do not attempt in any way, shape or form to replicate any aspect of that experiment. This is Most Haunted Live, the 8th of an unprecedented 8 nights of paranormal investigation. I'm joined now here in the studio by our regular team and Dr. David Holmes, who's a criminal psychologist from the Manchester Metropolitan University. David, let's start with you. What might have been going through Carl's mind there? Even though he knew he was safe, well, what would go through the mind of a condemned man at that point?
I think there's a lot of symbolism there, you know, the sensation of the rope round your neck and it being of that shape that you've seen so many times, you've seen your nightmares, if you like. It's one of those scenarios, and the major problem with fear, the anxiety surrounding this, is the expectation. It's what might happen, it's not when it actually does happen, which to some degree can be a relief. So it's building up in his mind, the tension's building up, and to be honest, even though Carl knew that he was safe, he still didn't know exactly what was going to happen when that trapdoor went.
You could almost see that if you read his body language there. He was looking down and swallowing, and obviously just thinking, I suppose time must have stretched to an eternity.
It does. And I think at the point of, you know, death, it certainly does. I mean, it has no bounds. I mean, it's like in dreams, you know, there's no limit in terms of, you know, the collapse of time, if you like. So many, many things can go on in your mind at that particular instance. And clearly, quite a lot did go on in Carl's mind. And I think there was this clear sense of, you know, perhaps a sense of relief, but he did look kind of very forlorn. Even after the event, he didn't have a big flush of no. Wow, you know, no. I'm okay, I'm fine, it all worked.
In fact, it's interesting you say that, because the other night we did a Tesla experiment, and Carl was inside a Faraday cage with Kieran and with Matt, and they received something like 750,000 volts of electricity. That was safe as well, but it's the psychological shock. But after that, there was almost triumph.
Yes.
There was no triumph.
There was no triumph. No triumph in this particular instance.
And could these hangings ever go wrong? Did these executions ever fail or go wrong?
Countlessly. You know, hanging is one of the more, one of the safest, let's say, forms of death, but, you know, they do go wrong. And there were two kinds of hanging. In the original instance, people were suffocated, they were strangled to death by being dragged behind a cart or, you know, just left to hang. They were just pushed off a ladder and left to dangle. And, you know, this took a long time, it was agonizing, etc. The modern form of hanging, perhaps stylized by Albert Pierpoint, was the drop. It was the instant snapping of the neck, the severing of the spinal cord, and instant death. And, you know, they had this down to a fine art. He had
not,
a few seconds.
Not, of course, the decapitation of the victim. And if they judged that drop wrong, and there was too great a drop, sometimes people could have their heads torn off.
Yes, their heads were literally torn off. Or it could go wrong in another way. They were kind of partially damaged and you know, hung there hanged there for ages. And were clearly, you know, it was clumsy hanging. I mean, we'd concentrate on the hangman as professional, but sometimes they were drunk, they were not particularly competent at their job, and people really did suffer far worse fates than death.
Thank you for the moment, Dr. David Holmes. That was the physical and the scientific aspect of hanging. Brian, very quickly, you're concerned about what might be coming back with the team in a psychical sense?
No, absolutely, because I think what we need to realise here, during and because of that experiment, is that the hangman, as indeed there was a hangman, has been cheated, of course, of a victim. Now, how many people walk away from the end of that noose? Yes, things can go wrong, it can be botched, but how many people actually walk away from it? None. But one did. Beattie did walk away from it. So it's quite understandable that he will bring something back with him, something that will indeed follow him back here to look and, you know, obtain that victim.
The team are on their way back now. Some team members have remained at those gallows. Let's find out what you're seeing and sensing via the webcams. Here's Julian Clegg and his interactive team.
Thanks, Paul. Interesting to compare what you were saying before the hanging and your reaction to what happened as well. Before the hanging took place, Josephine on the forum said, "I feel that the team will encounter 3 witches and a male related to them by blood. These females are not to be trusted. They mean harm. They don't want to be disturbed. Red is a big theme." Also, Josephine says, "Tonight, and being the first phase of a full moon, I feel tonight may be worse than last night, if that's possible." Pierre said, "Tell the team their names are being spoken on the webcams. Kath, Carl and Yvette's names have been spoken a few times, but Carl's in particular interesting, bearing in mind the hanging was about to happen." And then your reaction to the hanging. Extraordinary response. Thank you very much indeed for all your messages on the website about this. Helena in Plymouth, the hanging, incredible, realistic. It was just like years ago. Julian Fife says the screen was filled with people who seemed to be dancing by the steps of the hanging platform. Thank you for that observation. And George says, "I can see something walking around the woods looking for Carl." And then moving on, Catherine in Gloucester, "Wow, that was fantastic. Poor Carl, though, it made me feel sick just watching it on my screen." And Bryn, Hannah and Perrin in Blackpool said, "As soon as Carl was hanged, we heard jeering and eerie sort of carnival music and laughing, rather like from a crowd." Thank you for that message too. And finally, I leave with this thought. Lil has said, "I think some of the spirits that have been on the show over the last few nights are going to gang up on the team again tonight, and I think they may find themselves in big trouble. A portent of things to come as the team return to the theatre here in Morecambe. I wonder." Paul, back to you.
Thank you, Julian. Well, Carl has been lucky enough to survive, of course. Most people condemned to death by hanging did not. Here's Professor Mark Slevin from Manchester Metropolitan University to explain what actually happens when a person is hanged, and a bit of a health warning now. If you are squeamish or easily upset, you might want to consider looking away or leaving the room now.
Hanging is a method that's been used for centuries, and some of the possible reasons that it has been used in the past is unless something goes wrong, hanging is an efficient, quick and clean method of killing somebody. Although the thought of hanging somebody can appear quite a gruesome method of killing them, it is in fact one of the most humane methods if performed correctly. There are 2 main ways of hanging somebody. What happens if you're hanging your body from, say, around about 2 meters? The rope becomes taut, and the pressure is sufficient to snap the first and second vertebrae in the neck. This basically severs the spinal cord at this point. Severing the spinal cord means that there's no neuronal function which can transfer from the brain to the rest of the body, and therefore you die instantaneously. On the other hand, if there's no drop and you're just relying on the person's body weight and you're relying on asphyxiation, so the cord is tightening around the neck, affecting the breathing, affecting the arteries, asphyxiation and death can take between 3 and around about 20 minutes depending on the body weight of the person. So it's far less humane to use this method. Occasionally, if it's very harsh, the hanging, you can get blood seeping from the nose and the ears and the mouth. This is due to damage to the tongue, which can occur, and some of the smaller blood vessels which are in the auditory canal and the nasal passages can break, and so you might see a little bit of bleeding in these areas. I think why it was so popular in the past, hanging, is because you did used to get a lot of people wanting to watch, so people would have a sort of a day out really.
Grim, gruesome and grisly. The facts there behind the public execution by individuals by hanging. Now, Carl and the team are returning here. Carl went through that experiment, and it was an experiment. Do not try and replicate it at home. It was under strict scientific conditions. The idea of that mock hanging was not only to focus Carl's mind on the experience, but also to gather any emotions from the crowd and possibly, just possibly, to attract manifestations of spirits, other forms of energy to that intense emotional hotbed at the site of the gallows. The team are returning. We have no idea of knowing if they are returning alone. Who knows what might be coming back with them? Brian Shepherd, our medium clairvoyant and psychic artist, has his suspicions. You can find out what happens right here in the Winter Gardens in Morecambe after this. We leave you with some very harrowing images indeed.
Somebody from our team is going to be hanged.
Hang him. Ooh.
It's all right, it's just quite emotional, it's all right.